All right, so I know you're a big fan of the cable lateral delt raise. Can you talk us through why it can be a little bit more beneficial than the dumbbell regarding working through a greater range of motion?
Yeah, so in terms of the cable variation, we're able to stretch that medial delt and better position that load to be traveling behind our body rather than in front or beside, which again allows a deeper stretch, which is good for building muscle, and also does allow for a fairly large range of motion within more of that scapular plane, which is more of that 30 to 40 degrees rather than just straight out to the side.
Got it. And the medial delt, their main muscle action is abduction.
Yeah, pushing away from the midline.
Got it. And then when we're to the side, we're not necessarily getting as much out of this. So setting up at the cable here, because I want you to help walk me through this to allow me to actually get in proper position. That's going to allow us basically to go through a full range of abduction with the medial delt or lateral delt for that matter.
Correct. And you're also able to fully stretch it more, as I mentioned. So we could actually turn away from the load slightly, which is going to allow that arm to travel a little bit further behind the body and fully stretch that medial delt.
So step one would be getting into your position.
Yeah.
Now, when it comes to establishing position with the lateral cable delt raise, what are some landmarks to think about? So we want the arm obviously stretched, but like where should we be standing? Like how should our feet be?
Yeah.
Where should we position ourselves?
Absolutely. So I think if you start from like more of a neutral, so let's say you just bent down, you grab that, we're going to take one step out and over, and then I'm going to have you turn away from the load. Okay. Again, what that's going to allow you to do is rather than that being directly to the side of you, as you turn away from that load, you can see my arm is literally starting to pull itself into that position. And then we have the cable set up to where it's pulling directly against that stretch position.
So we're in our position, and then step two would be obviously the contracting portion.
Right.
Now with this, do we want to have a straight arm? Do we want to have a bent arm? Like how should our wrist position be? Like how can we make this a little bit more advantageous to allow us to get a little bit more of a medial feel, bias, etc.?
For me, this is a little bit more of a grip and rip exercise because one, it's loaded, it's overloaded lengthened. So you almost have to get yourself out of that bottom position. Again, if we're aligned well, that's going to be directly through your medial delt and you're going to feel that more from a muscular perspective. If you're not lined up properly or your arm path isn't right, then you're probably going to get some impingement or some joint stress within that. So if you are feeling some joint stress, maybe adjust.
Got it. So play with your position a little bit. And as long as you use kind of like that 30 to 40 degree angle as your like landmark, that's probably a pretty good betting position.
Yeah. So everyone's going to have a slightly different scapular angle and scapular position.
Got it. And then we're going to rely on this stretch to establish arm position and body position.
Exactly. And then we're just working to oppose that and travel through a typical lateral raise motion away from arm.
And I'm guessing like similar to dumbbells, if it's lighter loads, we could probably get away with a little bit more of a straighter arm versus a slight bend to avoid aggravating the elbows and actually like moving through a full range of motion to get the greatest amount of intensity and effort.
Absolutely. And if you need to use a lighter load, I think this is a great reason to do this. If you need to use a lighter load, then we can start to use things like integrated partials to help extend the stimulus more in that lengthened as we're going through that range of motion.
How high should I be bringing this weight up?
So I like anywhere from just above the shoulder, probably to about ear height.
Got it.
About right there, yeah.
And so if we come up any higher, we're going to be kind of losing out on some of that medial delt bias.
Well, it kind of just changes the exercise. Now, you can get a fairly large range of motion through that. And again, everyone's going to be slightly different. The better you're positioned, probably the more range you're going to get out of that. But if you want to get all the way up to the top, that's going to be more of a Y raise, as you can see me making more of a Y rather than a lateral, right? So that kind of changes an exercise a little bit, again, which has different functions.
And then another question for you, torso position. Do I want to be so fully vertical? Do I want to slide forward lean? So like when doing dumbbell lateral raises, for example, like I like to have a slight forward lean when I'm working the scapular plane. Do we want to adapt that same mindset here?
Yeah, I think keeping a strong upper back, nothing pinned down. We want our scapula to freely move and upwardly rotate as we go up. Don't retract, don't depress, nothing, none of that. Just allow your scapula to freely move. As Jake's going through this, his left scapula, his left shoulder blade, as he goes through it, is going to upwardly rotate with that load, which is going to allow all of that to be stabilized around his shoulder blade.
Got it.
Yeah.
And now step three, the eccentric. Do we want to always control that? Like, how far do we come down with this? Because I know you mentioned like that's a grip and rip. Like, do we want to start maybe or like at least stop a range of motion a little bit more shallow on this eccentric just to avoid like pulling ourselves into a wonky position? Like, what would you recommend?
Yeah, keep a rigid torso position, right? So we're not locking anything down, but we are keeping a rigid torso position. So I don't want this load to pull him over or anything like that. Because again, that's not a deeper stretch in the delt. That's just moving around the load to reach a certain destination rather than further stretching.
So it's like forcing that range of motion just for the sake of thinking you're getting more benefit.
Exactly.
And now I know you mentioned lengthened partials. I'm going to turn this way because I would love for you to kind of walk us through that and like show like what that looks like in practice. So let's say I'm going here, I'm performing my lateral delt raises. I've hit a point of fatigue. Like, what does a good lengthened partial look like in the context of this exercise?
Yeah, so there's two ways to kind of integrate these. One is at the end of your set. So that's probably the most common for most people, which is when you get to the end of your set, and let's say Jake can no longer get a full range of motion rep. So let's say he stops here. Okay, great. Now we're going to integrate some partials into that when that muscle is most stretched and lengthened, right? And so depending on how you want to perform it, you could have a certain range of motion stop where it's like, okay, I'm going to do partials until I reach 20% range of motion, right? So I'm a quarter of the rep. So let's say he's getting halfway there, and he's going to do partials and drive through that load as hard as he can until he gets to the point where he can only do, so probably one more here, where you can only get a quarter of that rep, and that isn't one way to do it. Another way to integrate this, just to give Jake a fresh arm here, is an integrated partial, which is think more like a 1 1/4 rep. So if we do a full range of motion rep, good, and then we're going to go a quarter of the way up, good, back down, now all the way up, good. So that's one total rep, right? So 1 all the way up, good, and then a quarter rep, back down. And what that's doing is essentially overloading and adding more time under tension where that rep is the hardest, right? Which is a very beneficial way of training more for muscle growth.
Awesome. Well, hopefully folks can take this exercise and apply it to the program, but I know not everybody has a good cable setup. So can we talk about the dumbbell lateral raise before we take this video out and just go over maybe a couple of ways where people can optimize or just get a little bit more out of that exercise where they might not be fully leveraging it properly now?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right, so let's go over 3 tips for getting a little bit more out of the dumbbell lateral raise for folks who don't have a cable setup.
So if you don't have a cable setup, one, that's super common, so don't feel bad about that. Dumbbells are still a great option for building the delts in terms of moving that arm through abduction, just moving the arm away from the midline of the body. That's our main job with this movement. So instead of, I think a common thing that many people do is wanting to come straight out with the dumbbells. And that's certainly how I learned the movement as well. And what most folks are going to may feel is some slight impingement with this arm positioning. So we're going to tweak that arm angle a little bit more to be more in the scapular plane, which is somewhere around that 30 to 40 degrees, right? Giving that shoulder capsule a little bit more space and a little bit less opportunity for impingement to be happening. You can have a slight lean at the torso. Now we're not leaning over at the low back. We're going to be going from and hinging at the hip here. Okay, very similar to maybe the start of an RDL, if you will. Another thing that's commonly used here as an intensifier to this, if you want to add a little bit of an emphasis. So the dumbbell lateral raise is really good for getting that medial division of the delt, those middle delts, in a short and contracted position, right? So we can pause there at the top. Good for a 1 count, 2 count, whatever feels good. And then don't forget the eccentric. Again, it's the most productive part, controlling the speed of those reps. Think slow, 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 explode up, hold, down, slow, slow, slow. Good. And the last tip here, as you fatigue, if you want to intensify this a little bit more, you got a little bit more left in the tank and you don't have access to cables, this is where I start to really generate a little bit of English, little body momentum. Good. Don't be afraid here as you fatigue to get yourself a little bit of momentum, right? You can start to use those hips a little bit and start to generate a little of that momentum. Good. And that's just going to help you eke out another 5 to 10 reps as you fatigue and really get a lot more out of this movement.
I love it, dude. Well, hopefully y'all are able to build some bigger delts than myself. All of Austin's information is going to be linked down below. He has an awesome platform for both coaching. He has an app. He has a sick content platform as well. Austin, thank you so much for coming on. I'm winded. I'm
Thanks, man.
Yes.
Working against LDS.